Imagine you're at the grocery store. You hand the cashier a crisp $20 bill, and they hand you your groceries. Simple. But if you handed them a green $20 bill from a Monopoly board, you wouldn't get dinner. You'd get a confused look. Yet in the physical world, those two pieces of paper are nearly identical. They are just blends of cotton, linen, and colored ink. You can't eat them, you can't wear them, you can't build a house out of them. For most of human history, money made sense because it was made of things that actually had physical uses. People traded with silver, or salt, or gold. If the financial system collapsed, you still had a lump of metal you could melt down or turn into jewelry. Today, almost the entire global economy runs on what we call fiat money. It basically means money by declaration. It has value because the government points to a piece of paper and simply decides, this is what you will use to trade. But a declaration doesn't explain why you get up and go to work every day. A politician simply saying, it is so, doesn't magically convince millions of people to trade their hard-earned labor, their time, and their goods for a piece of paper that does nothing on its own. The system starts with the law. Governments pass legal tender laws, mandating that if you owe a debt, the creditor is legally required to accept this specific paper. If they refuse, courts won't help collect that debt. But a law on its own still isn't enough to build an economy. If the government announced tomorrow that torn-up pieces of cardboard were now legal tender, you would probably still ask to be paid in food, or tools, or something you can actually use. To actually force people to use their paper, governments use a very clever trap: taxes. The state requires every citizen to pay income and property taxes. They dictate that those taxes can only be paid using their specific paper currency. The government doesn't need to convince you that the paper is special. They have to create a massive debt that you are legally required to pay and make their paper the only way to settle it. This creates a ripple effect across the economy. To avoid penalties from the tax office, you have to find dollars. So you trade your time and your physical work to an employer specifically to get that paper money. When you take those dollars to the grocery store, the store owner accepts them in exchange for real food. They don't want the paper itself, but they know they need a constant supply of dollars to pay their own corporate and property taxes. That underlying constant need pushes the paper through the entire economy. The store pays the farmer pays the mechanic, and the mechanic buys groceries. This forced obligation creates a universal network of trust. You accept the paper because you know the next person will accept it from you, not because they like the paper, but because they have a debt to the government that only those bills can pay. There is one massive vulnerability to this setup. If anyone with a printer could just make their own dollars to pay their tax bills, the money would multiply until it was everywhere. It wouldn't be rare anymore, and that trust would vanish. That is why the system requires an institutional bouncer. In the United States, that bouncer is the Federal Reserve. They hold a strict, legally enforced monopoly on creating new money. The central bank's primary job is to act as a gatekeeper. By carefully managing how much of this paper exists, they make sure the currency remains scarce enough that it doesn't lose its value. Without that monopoly, people would print money until it was cheaper than the paper it was printed on. The shared belief in the system survives because a central authority limits how much of it you can get. Governments are run by people, and sometimes they lose control over their spending. If a government spends far more than it collects in taxes, it might try to use its monopoly to recklessly print new money just to pay its own bills. This leads to hyperinflation. The supply of money explodes, so each individual bill becomes less rare. Prices skyrocket as merchants try to keep up, and eventually people stop believing the money is worth anything at all. In the 2000s, the government of Zimbabwe printed so much currency that prices were doubling every 24 hours. They eventually had to print individual bills with a face value of $100 trillion, and even those could barely buy a loaf of bread. We saw the same thing happen in Venezuela. The local bolivar lost its ability to actually buy anything. Citizens were forced to abandon their own currency and started using stable foreign money, like the US dollar, just to keep their families fed. When a government stops exercising self-control over its spending, the shared hallucination breaks. The trust that holds the entire network together snaps, and the money instantly turns back into what it physically is: worthless paper. Since this can go so wrong, why do we use it? Why not just go back to the safety of the gold standard, where money was tied to a physical resource that a politician couldn't just print. As this diagram shows, the answer is flexibility. On the left, a gold standard is like a rigid, tight belt. It keeps things in place, but it restricts the economy when it needs to grow. On the right, fiat money is like a pair of sweatpants. The money supply can stretch and expand smoothly as the world grows. This grants a real-world superpower during a crisis. In 2008, banks suddenly froze up and stopped lending money, the economic equivalent of a heart attack. Because fiat money is flexible, the central bank acted as an emergency donor, creating new money to pump cash back into the system. This kept the blood of the economy moving, so businesses could stay open. Removing that rigid link to gold gives the economy room to breathe. That flexibility is exactly what allows a modern, growing world to adapt to shocks and keep moving forward.